everybody. Another week. It's a beautiful Monday morning. A little bit, it's sunny, but it's windy and cool in the Midwest. Welcome back. I am Professor Khalil Amani, and this is Khalil Amani's World 100. We are still talking Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're on part 12. I mean, as you all can see, I'm not rehashing and regurgitating the same narrative. Excuse me. Orange juice. Each episode, each part is a new revelation. I want to exhaust this subject of Sodom and Gomorrah. I want to be comprehensive. I want to leave no stone unturned, so that when future generations or future whatever look at this series, they can say, wow, that guy Khalil Amani, he did it all. As I've said, I'm not like no other YouTube Bible teacher. They talk about a subject, one video, and they think they've exhausted it. But when you understand a subject, it takes more than an hour and a half or 2 hours to exhaust it if you really want to be thorough. As the streets say, I'm surgical with this shit. And when you're surgical with a subject, it means you are precise. That you go in there and use the special tools and utensils so that you can get out the cancer without nicking and scarring lungs and organs and other vital tissues. That's what it means to be surgical. And when we talk about Bible conversations, that's what I am. I'm a surgeon. My detractors and my enemies and my foes, they're over there looking at me every day. They look at me every day thinking, God damn, this guy just keeps going like an Energizer bunny. They'll never admit it, but they saying, damn, that nigga Khalil Amani, he's a beast. He's a fucking beast. Thank you. So we're on part 12 of this Sodom and Gomorrah series. And on this part 12, I want to go back and I want to look at a couple of ancient historians, and I want to read from their work, their position on Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm talking about two of the greatest Jewish or Hebrew or Israelite, even if they became a Jew or Roman. I want to look at their works. Who am I talking about? The two greatest ancient Near Eastern writers, historians, are Josephus and Philo. Do you have the works of Josephus and Philo? Have you ever heard of Josephus and Philo? Well, if you haven't, Josephus and Philo, they are them niggas. They are those first century niggas. Josephus and Philo are the authorities of first century Palestine. Their word means everything to Jews and Christians alike. I want to talk about them. And I want to go and read their first person narratives on Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what I want to do on this part 12. But before we do that, let me give you their rundowns let me show you who they are. Let's start with Josephus. Flavius Josephus. He was an Israelite. He was a Jew who converted and became a Roman of sorts. But Flavius Josephus was a historian. And let's look at his background real quick. We'll just go to Wikipedia. Simple enough. We'll go to Wikipedia. That's supposed to be Flavius Josephus. Josephus. See? His name was Flavius Josephus. But he was born a Jew. He was born Yosef ben Mattheyahu. That's clearly a Jewish name. Joseph, the son of Mattheyahu. And he was born AD 37. So about 4 years after the death of Jesus, Flavius Josephus is born. He lived to be about 60 some years. Born in 37, died in the year 100 AD or CE. Got it? Flavius Josephus was a Roman/Jewish historian and military leader, best known for his writing The Jewish War. He was born in Jerusalem, then part of the Roman province of Judea, to a father of priestly descent and a mother who claimed Hasmonean royal ancestry. So he was a Jew who converted and defected. Down here it tells you right here who he was. Flavius Josephus fully defected to the Roman side and was granted Roman citizenship. Got it? He became an advisor and close associate of Vespasian's son Titus, serving as his translator during Titus's protracted siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, which resulted in the near total razing of the city and the destruction of the Second Temple. Alrighty. But the main thing to know that he was a historian right here. Flavius Josephus, he was a Roman Jewish historian. Got it? Got it. That's the first person. We're going to be looking at his works. We're going to be looking at what he said about Sodom and Gomorrah. All right. And the second one is Philo. There's Philo. Some might say Philo, but Philo. Now Philo of Alexandria, Hebrew, what does it say? Also called Philo Judaeus, was a Hellenistic Jew. So he was Jewish too. A Greek Jew, philosopher. He was more of a philosopher who lived in Alexandria in the Roman province of Egypt. The only event in Philo's life that can be decisively dated is his representation of the Alexandrian Jews in the delegation of the Roman Emperor Caligula in 40 CE. But look at how he was born. He was born. He was born 20 years before the birth of Jesus, or probably, they say Jesus was actually born in, some say 6 BC, whatever. Well, for the sake, we'll just say he was born 20 years before Jesus, and he dies about 33 from that. And he lived about another 27 years after Jesus' death. Jesus supposedly died in AD 33 or CE 33. Yeah. But this guy right here, Philo, a philosopher, he was born 20 years before Jesus, and he died some 17 years, 33, some 27 years after Jesus died. That's right. I got my math right? Yeah. I'm gonna get my math right. That's right. So Philo is born. Philo, the great philosopher Philo, is born 20 years before the birth of Jesus and outlives Jesus by about 27 years. So Philo is a contemporary. The word contemporary meaning they are the same generation. They were living at the same time, walking on the same earth, living in the same neck of the woods, the ancient Near East, Palestine, Jerusalem. They were on this earth at the same time. Thus, Philo is a contemporary of Jesus Christ. What's interesting about Philo's work, as I said on part 12, on part 11, for some strange reason, Philo never mentions Jesus. Philo never talks about Jesus Christ. They were contemporaries, lived in the same area, same time. But it looks like Philo was totally unaware of Jesus' presence. Now, Josephus would write about Philo. Josephus would write about Jesus. But most historians say that the entry on Jesus Christ in Josephus' work is a Christian forgery. That's the consensus of scholarship. That not even Josephus, who came along some years after the death of Jesus, that he didn't write about Jesus either. That the entry on Jesus in Josephus' work is not authentic, it's not original, it is a Christian forgery. But we're not talking about that. Those are just side issues. Now let's get into the lecture. You see, what you have to understand is that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is a Jewish story. It is a Hebrew story. It is an Israelite story. It's not a Christian story. It's not a Chinese story. It's not a Russian story. It's not an African story. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah was created by the Jews, by the Hebrews, and by the Israelites. So that's who we should go and look at first. We should look at those people from that nation and what they thought about the Sodom and Gomorrah story. We know what Christians would do with it later on. You see, the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative supposedly originated anywhere from the 1600 BCE to the 1800 BCE. So by the time people like Josephus and Philo come on the scene to write about Sodom and Gomorrah, some 1600 years have gone by. Some 1,600 years later, these people are born. Even going further to you people who are living today in the 21st century, you are about 2,000, 3,000. You're about 3,500 years after the fact, Johnny come lately commenting on a story of Jewish, of Hebrew, of Israelite origin. I said, you today, you who are living today, you Christians, you fake ass Israelites, you about 3,500 years later retelling a story. And the reality is, the so-called Hebrew Israelites today, the so-called Israelites today, they have not adopted the ancient Israelite understanding of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. They have adopted the Christian understanding of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they have leaned toward homosexuality as the cause of Sodom and Gomorrah's demise. That's a fact. How do you call yourself a Christian? Excuse me, rewind. How do you call yourself an Israelite today, yet you have a Christian interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah? How do you call yourself a Hebrew today, yet your interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah is straight out of the annals of Christianity? How do you call yourself a Hebrew Israelite, yet your understanding and interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah is not that of your ancestors, it's not that of your forefathers, it's not that of the ancient Israelites, it's of the first century Christians? That's a fact upon fact. We should look at that also. So when we go to Wikipedia, Wikipedia will tell us how the ancient Jews understood the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Wikipedia will also tell us how the evolving evolutionary Christians would come along and how they would reinterpret the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. How the ancient Israelites saw inhospitality, stinginess, and greed as the cause of the demise and destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Wikipedia will also show us how the later Christians would come along and adopt and reinterpret and rewrite the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative and give it that homosexual spin that most of you niggas are running with today. It's right there on Wikipedia. It's right here. Let's go over here before we get to reading what they say. I said, we can go to Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, and they have an entry on Sodom and Gomorrah. Look what it says. In the Abrahamic religions, that means the Jew, the Hebrew, the Israelite, Sodom and Gomorrah were two cities destroyed by God for their wickedness. Their story parallels the Genesis flood narrative in its theme of God's anger provoked by man's sin. They are mentioned frequently in the Nevi'im section of the Hebrew Bible, as well as in the New Testament, as symbols of human wickedness and divine retribution. And the Quran, Islam, contains a version of the story about the two cities. Now, the origins and meaning of the names Sodom and Gomorrah are uncertain, though some scholars suggest they derive from Hebrew and Semitic roots, with Gomorrah linked to the ideal of deep and copious water. The Hebrew Bible refers to the cities and which were transliterated into Greek, blah, 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 blah. But now let's go on down here. Let's look at how they thought about that story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Here it is right here. Biblical and deuterocanonical texts expand on the story, portraying Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of sin often linked to adultery, not homosexuality. For adultery to have taken place, there must be a man and a woman who are married. You got it? Biblical and deuterocanonical texts expand on the story portraying Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of sin, often linked to adultery, man and woman, adultery, arrogance, inhospitality, not homosexuality. We did 2 whole things on hospitality, and there it is right there in Wikipedia. Got it? And so the ancient Jews, in the biblical and deuterocanonical texts, they expand on the story portraying Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of sin, often linked to adultery. That's heterosexual sex between married people who go outside of the marriage bed to have sex. That's what adultery is. Adultery, arrogance, inhospitality, and oppression of the poor. See? Not feeding the strangers and the poor people, rather than explicitly sexual immorality. Wow. Wow. And it goes on to say references in the New Testament, including Matthew, Luke, Jude, and Revelations, use the cities as warnings of divine judgment, with some interpretations highlighting sexual transgressions, while others emphasize violence, injustice, and violations of hospitality. See? Scholars debate the precise nature of the sins, noting that the Hebrew term yada, to know, in Genesis 19 could imply sexual assault, but may also be interpreted as a demand to interrogate or dominate visitors, reflecting the city's moral corruption and broadly. Okay, so when we go down, we can scroll down. There's a lot on Sodom and Gomorrah, but it actually gives you the Hebrew or Jewish. It talks about the hospitality interpretation, which I pushed to the nth degree. Now we have a thing called religious views. Religious views. Now what we have to understand again is that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not a Christian story. It's not a Buddhist story. It's not a Muslim story. It's not a Hindu story. It's not an Egyptian story. It is a Hebrew story. It is a Jewish story. It is an Israelite story. It is a Semitic Israelite, Jewish, Hebrew, Israelite story. And since they are the ones who originate the story, they have the first word on what the story was about. Not later Christians, not later Muslims, but we're going to the source of the story. And the source of the story is from Judaism, from the Hebrews, from the Israelites. Got it? And it says, later Hebrew prophets named the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah as adultery, pridefulness, and uncharitableness. Wow. Wow. We're talking about Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah. The later Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, they don't label the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as some homosexual, sin. The Hebrew prophets named the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah as adultery. That would be heterosexual sex. That would be a married woman and a married man, and one of them goes outside and cheats on their husband or wife. That is adultery. That is heterosexual abomination. Adultery, pridefulness, and uncharitableness. That's called inhospitality. Remember, It was the Jews, it was the Israelites, it was the Hebrews who wrote the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So their word and their interpretation is the truest, most purest understanding of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they believe that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has to do with heterosexual adultery, with being prideful, and with being uncharitable. That has to do with hospitality. See? Richard Norton views classical Jewish texts as stressing the cruelty and lack of hospitality of the inhabitants of Sodom to the stranger. Wow. Rabbinic writings, that's Jewish, that's Hebrew, that's Israelite. Rabbinic writings affirm, yes, yes, yes. Rabbinic writings affirm that the Sodomites also committed economic crimes. That's economic, meaning money. Blasphemy, bloodshed, yes. Yes, yes, yes. That's the Jewish mind. So if you are a Hebrew Israelite today, if you call yourself an Israelite today, and you are teaching that Sodom and Gomorrah's sin was homosexuality, you have gone away from the original views of Judaism, from the original views of the Hebrews, and from the original views of the Israelites. That's just a fact. Because clearly, the Hebrew prophets, they named the sins of Sodom as adultery, pridefulness, and uncharitableness, not homosexuality. Look at you calling yourself the children of Israel today and got the story all bastardized. It wouldn't be for 1,500 years until the Christians came about. We can read some more. That's one scholar. I guess his name is Richard Norton. Here's another guy. His name is John D. Levinson. You can click on there and see who they are. It says John D. Levinson views a rabbinic, that's the Hebrew, that's the Israelite tradition described in the Mishnah as postulating that the sin of Sodom was a violation of conventional hospitality. See, here we go. In addition to homosexual acts. But what does it mention first? A conventional hospitality. That's just him. Yeah. J. Michelson, another scholar, proposes a reading of the story of Sodom that emphasizes the violation of hospitality as well as the violence of the Sodomites. Homosexual rape is the way in which they violated hospitality. There you go. Not the essence of their transgression. In other words, not the homosexual act, but how they raped. That men would try to rape angels and men would try to rape young boys. That was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. But he talks about it's a violation of hospitality. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then, some 1600 years later, after the Sodom and Gomorrah event, Christianity would come on the scene, and it is Christianity that would flip the script. It is Christianity that would make it about, homosexuality. Yeah. And it talks about it right here. All throughout it. And of course, Islam, being a Johnny-come-lately religion, after Judaism and after Christianity, they would simply talk about the story and make it about homosexuality also. Okay? So, there you have there we have this view. And so, to my Hebrew Israelite brothers and sisters, I said to my Hebrew Israelite brothers and sisters, to my Israelite brothers and sisters, if you are interpreting Sodom and Gomorrah's sin as simply one of homosexuality, you are not in line with your forefathers and foremothers. If you are interpreting Sodom and Gomorrah as a crime of homosexuality, you have strayed away from the Hebrew prophets of old. For the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they made Sodom's crime one of arrogance and pride and being cheapskates, not upholding and not helping the poor and the needy, being arrogant and haughty. If you have not taught that as a Hebrew Israelite, as an Israelite, you, my friend, have strayed away from your own Hebrew prophets' teachings. That's what Wikipedia says. Wikipedia charges you with going astray. Wikipedia charges you with false teachings. Wikipedia charges you Israelites with shedding the true and most honest teachings about Sodom and Gomorrah, that these people were inhospitable, and exchanging the original teachings for that of the Christian perception and teachings of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's say that. How do you call yourself a Hebrew Israelite? How do you call yourself an Israelite, yet you teach a Christian interpretation that runs contrary to and is the very juxtaposition of the Jewish, of the Hebrew, of the Israelite version of Sodom and Gomorrah? How do you do it? How do you do it? I know some of you do it out of ignorance. You don't know. But right there on Wikipedia, it tells you what the Jewish position was on Sodom and Gomorrah. That it was about hospitality. It was about fairness, treating the stranger with kindness and respect. But you call yourself the original Jew of the Bible, the original Hebrew of the Bible, the original Israelite of the Bible, but your teachings on Sodom and Gomorrah aren't original. Your teachings aren't from the originators. Your teachings on Sodom aren't from the inventors. Your teachings aren't from those who concocted and wrote the narrative of the Sodom and Gomorrah myth. Your teachings on Sodom and Gomorrah, if you believe they were destroyed for homosexuality, that's not from the Hebrew mind. That's not from the Jewish pen. That's not from the stories of the Israelites. That's from the mind of the later Gentile Christians of the first century who would come along and flip the script and rewrite the narrative and switch it from hospitality to homosexuality. The only thing the Christians kept was the fact that hospitality and homosexuality start with the letter H. But they would absolutely, I said the Christians would absolutely deviate from the original understanding, from the Jewish interpretation, from the Hebrew interpretation, from the Israelite interpretation. How are you as an Israelite today following a Gentile European Christian interpretation and not the interpretation of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, your own countrymen. Shame, shame, shame. I wanted to start out with that. Now, let's go into the first person narratives. Let's go into the first person narratives of the two great historians and philosophers, Flavius Josephus and Philo. And let's just read what they said about these stories on Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's start with Josephus. Again, Flavius Josephus was an Israelite. He was a Hebrew who dropped his Hebrew citizenship and became a Roman citizen. He became a Roman collaborator. He worked with the Roman government in the dismantling of Masada, in the dismantling of the Jewish temple. He was there when the Romans under Titus ransacked and overthrew the temple in 70 AD, which caused the Israelites to scatter into places like North Africa. And as the Hebrew Israelites, or these black Israelites would say today, that from Titus and his destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that these Israelites would run all down into Africa. They would even surmise that they ended up on places like West Africa and subsequently became slaves in the New World, and that's how they today claim to be Israelites or Hebrews, because of the events that happened under the Roman general Titus and his ransacking of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. Josephus was there for all of that. Although born a Jew himself, some would say he was an Uncle Tom, some would say he was a Benedict Arnold, some would say he's a traitor to his race. I got no issue with none of those particular understandings of Flavius Josephus. But as a writer and a historian, his work is par excellence. I said his work is par excellence. So let's go into his actual work and let us read what he wrote about Sodom and Gomorrah. First person narratives. Again, Flavius Josephus was born 4 years after the death of Jesus. Jesus dies in 33. Flavius Josephus is born in 37. And he dies in the year 100 AD, 100 CE. Not quite a contemporary of Jesus, but yet he was a contemporary of Jesus. I mean, we're talking about a 4-year difference between a death and a birth. So some would argue that he is a contemporary. You don't have to be born exactly or be alive when someone else is alive to be a contemporary. As long as you're within that space, 20, 30, 40 years, you could be considered a contemporary of something else or somebody else. So Josephus was born 4 years after the death of Jesus, and he becomes the greatest of the Jewish historians, even though he renounced his Jewishness and he took on the name Flavius Josephus. That's not the name his mother and father gave him. We talked about that earlier. I said that's not the name Flavius Josephus was born with. He was born Yosef ben Mattiyahu. That's Joseph, the son of Matthew Yahu. That's a Hebrew, that is a Jewish, that is an Israelite name, but he changed his name to a Roman name, Flavius Josephus. Got it? And he was a Roman Jewish historian. Now let's go read what he said about Sodom and Gomorrah. In Book 1 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 11, first person narrative, he writes, the title is How God Overthrew the Nation of the Sodomites out of his wrath against them for their sins. About this time, the Sodomites grew proud. See, the same narrative. This is a Jewish perspective. It ain't about homosexuality. Let me just read and then I'll come back. About this time, the Sodomites grew proud on account of their riches and great wealth. They became unjust towards men, impious towards God, insomuch that they did not call to mind the advantages they received from him. They hated strangers and abused themselves with sodomitical practices. God was therefore much displeased at them and determined to punish them for their pride, and to overthrow their city and to lay waste their country until there should neither plant nor fruit grow out of it. See? That's just a part. He goes on to say, let's see. He talks about what happened in Sodom. When Abraham heard this, what did he hear? Abraham heard that there was no good men in Sodom. See? And that one of them was sent to inform about, no, go up here. Then they concealed themselves no longer, but declared that they were angels. This is talking to Abraham, angels of God, and that one of them was sent to inform them about the child, and the two of the overthrow of Sodom. When Abraham heard this, he was grieved for the Sodomites. Look at Abraham catching feelings for the Sodomites. He was grieved for the Sodomites, and he rose up and besought God for them, and entreated him that he would not destroy the righteous with the wicked. And when God had replied that there was no good man among the Sodomites, for if there were but 10 such men among them, he would not punish any of them for their sins. Abraham held his peace, and the angels came to the city of Sodom of the Sodomites, and Lot entreated them to accept of a lodging for him. For he, Lot, was a very generous and hospitable man. See, that word keeps coming. Even Flavius Josephus used that word hospitable from hospitality. And one that had learned to imitate the goodness of Abraham. Now, when the Sodomites saw the young men, aka the two angels, to be of beautiful countenances, and this to an extraordinary degree, and that they took up their lodging with Lot, they resolved themselves to enjoy these beautiful boys by force and violence. You know the rest of the story. So, Josephus has read the Hebrew Bible, and Josephus understands the Sodomite story from the point of the view of the actual Jews themselves. We know this because Flavius Josephus tells us in the very beginning that about this time the Sodomites grew proud. See, he doesn't talk about their sexual proclivities. He talks about being proud or arrogant on account of their riches and great wealth. They became unjust towards men and impious towards God, insomuch that they did not call to mind the advantages they received from him. They hated strangers. If you hate strangers, that means you are inhospitable. It all goes back to that word that's never even written in the Bible, hospitality. See, Flavius Josephus understands the story not as a story of God's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah because they were homosexual. He understands it from the standpoint that they were inhospitable, that they hated strangers, that they were proud, and that they were super rich, and they was flossing and flexing and shitting on other countries and cities and nations because of their wealth. God was therefore much displeased at them and determined to punish them for their pride, not for their homosexuality, but for their pride. Pride. And so that's Flavius Josephus's first person narrative. This is a man who lived 2,000 years before you and I. Damn near 2,000 years ago. Flavius Josephus would write about Sodom and Gomorrah and would stay within the Jewish interpretation, the Jewish confines, that the story was about people who were super prideful, super rich, exorbitant in their richness, a people that hated strangers, hated visitors, hated wayfarers, hated wanderers, hated poor people, a people that wouldn't strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 and 50. Flavius Josephus stays within the cozy, comfy confines of the Jewish, of the Hebrew, of the Israelite interpretation of the story. Even though Flavius Josephus renounced his Jewishness, even though Flavius Josephus renounced his Jewish name, he still maintained the essence of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah's sins and why God destroys the cities. Nowhere in there is it homosexuality. It's all about pride, arrogance, stinginess, greedy, being super wealthy and super rich, hating strangers. That's what it's all about. And so Flavius Josephus, he got it right. Say what thou wilt about Flavius Josephus. Say what you want about this first century Jewish historian. He got the story of Sodom and Gomorrah exactly right. He stayed within the Jewish confines. And thank God, when Flavius Josephus was writing the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Christianity was no more than a splintered sect of many different varieties of understandings of a little Jewish boy named Jesus. They had not come together. The Roman Catholic Church had not developed and become strong yet. They had not many councils on talking about interpretations, Christian interpretations. None of that was around. And so Flavius Josephus, he didn't fall for Christian interpretations, because the Christian religion was just in its infancy. It was just getting underway in circa 50, 60, 70 AD or CE. They were a splintered and fractured group. On one hand, you had the original followers of Jesus, James, Peter, John, Mary Magdalene, the beloved disciple, and them. The original hearers, followers of Jesus that sat with Jesus, They were called the Jerusalem church. On the other hand, you had a dude that never walked with Jesus, didn't know Jesus. A nigga that was a Jewish persecutor named Saul. A Roman puppet stoolie, satrap, lackey dog of the Roman regime who converts to the Jesus people. But that's not enough. This guy Saul, who becomes Paul, he claims he's the messenger, and his message is not to other Jews, it's not to other Hebrews, it's not to other Israelites. He says my message is for the Gentiles, the Europeans, the white folks. I'm gonna go over yonder and I'm gonna convert Gentiles. Flavius Josephus, he didn't have to worry about that, because while Paul was over there in Corinth and Antioch and Laodicea and Sicily and Rome converting white folks, he was writing the Jewish histories from the Jewish perspective. Flavius Josephus, first person narrative. Moving right along. Philo, some call him a historian, but to be more correct, Philo was a philosopher. Philo was a philosopher. Philo was one of the great philosophers of antiquity and a great writer. Philo was born some 20 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, and he died 27 years after Jesus Christ. So Philo was certainly, as a matter of fact, he was a contemporary of Jesus. They might have walked down the street and passed each other and did not know who each other were. They lived in the same neck of the woods, the same part of the world, yet in all of Philo's writings, how many pages is this? 900 plus pages in the works of Philo. Living and walking the same period as Jesus Christ, Philo never once mentions Jesus Christ. But Philo did have an understanding of the events in Sodom and Gomorrah. Philo was a Hellenized Jew. He was a Jew of Greek proclivities. He was a Jew of Greek background, but a Jew nonetheless. And so, certainly, when Philo was writing his history of Sodom and Gomorrah, he did it from a metaphysical, spiritual, theoretical, and philosophical interpretation. But he never strays from the sincerity of the Jewish interpretation. And again, thank God that Christianity had not even been on the scene when he started writing. By the time Jesus is born, Philo is 20 years old. By the time Jesus is 10, Philo is 30 years old. By the time Jesus is 20, Philo is 40 years old. By the time Jesus is 30, when he first comes on the scene teaching that ism, Philo is 50 years old and well into his writings in the philosophical understanding of the Jewish people. Well, he's 50 years old when Jesus begins his ministry at the age of 30. So there is no Christianity for him to bounce off of or to get sidetracked. There's no Christianity. Paul is not around. Jesus is just getting started. The man is 50 years old when Jesus starts at the age of 30. So he's well into the writing of his philosophical histories of the Jewish people. So he's not tainted. He's not tainted when it comes to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's not tainted by the Christian ideology, the Christian interpretation, or the Christian mindset, because the Christian has not been born yet. Now let's go and let's read what he says about Sodom and Gomorrah. What's interesting about what he says about Sodom and Gomorrah and how to find it is that he starts the Sodom and Gomorrah story on my birth date. I was born on April 23rd. And so on page 423, he starts the Sodom story. What a coinky dink. I looked at that. I said, I was about to put a bookmarker. I was about to put a bookmarker in here so I can go to it. But I said, wait a minute. I don't need a bookmarker. He starts the Sodom and Gomorrah story on my birth date, 423, April 23rd. So I know where it's at. What a coincidence. So I go to page 423, and we can read about it. You think I'm lying? And I show you. I said we go to page 423, April 23rd. That's Khalil's birthday. And we read about the Sodomites. So let's see how he talks about the people of Sodom. It's a lot of reading, but I'm going to read it. But God, having taken pity on mankind, as being a savior and full of love for mankind, increased as far as possible the natural desire of men and women for a connection together, for the sake of producing children and detesting the unnatural and unlawful commerce of the people of Sodom. Here we go. The unnatural and unlawful commerce of the people of Sodom, he extinguished it and destroyed those who were inclined to these things. And that not by any extraordinary chastisement, but he inflicted on them an astonishing novelty, an unheard of rarity of vengeance. For on a sudden he commanded the sky to become overclouded and to pour forth mighty shower, not of rain, but of fire. And as the flame poured down with the resistless and unceasing violence, the fields were burnt up, and the meadows, and all the dense groves, and the thick marshes, and the impenetrable thickets. The plain too was consumed, and all the crops of wheat, and of everything else that was sown, and all the trees of the mountain district were burnt up, the trunks and the very roots being consumed. And the folds of cattle, and the houses of men, and the walls, and all that was in any building, whether of private or public property, were all burnt. And in one day, these populous cities became the tomb of their inhabitants. Woo! Wow. And the vast edifices of stone and timber became thin dust and ashes. And then the flames had consumed everything that was visible and that existed on the face of the earth. They proceeded to burn even the earth itself, penetrating into its lowest recesses, and destroying all the vivifying powers which existed within it, so as to produce a complete and everlasting barrenness, so that it should never again be able to bear fruit or to put forth any verdure. I had to look that word up. Verdure means lush green vegetation. And to this very day, it is scorched up, for the fire of the lightning is what is most difficult to extinguish and creeps on pervading everything and smoldering. See, it's a lot. And the most evident proof of this is to be found in what is seen to this day. For the smoke, which is still emanated, and the sulfur which men dig up there, are proof of the calamity which befell that country, while a most conspicuous proof of the ancient fertility of the land is left in one city, that would be the fifth city, and in the land around it, for the city is very populous, and the land is fertile in grass and in corn and in every kind of fruit, as a consistent evidence of the punishment which was inflicted by the divine will on the rest of the country. See? He goes on. He talks about how this country was destroyed. The country of the people of Sodom, because of the 5 finest cities, in it 4 were about to be destroyed by fire, and 1 was destined to be left unhurt and safe from every evil. That's right. So there were 5 cities total, but 4 of them were destroyed: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. But the 5th city that was left, that was destined to be left unhurt, that was the city of Zoar, aka Bela. See? It goes down and says it again. The 5 cities of the land of Sodom are figurative representations of the 5 outward senses which exist in us. Now he gets into some philosophical stuff, about the 5 senses, sight, hearing, smell, touch, taste, that kind of stuff. Let me see if there's anything else I want to. Yeah, he talks about the 5 cities being, same as the hearing, the taste, the smell, and the touch. For all day and all night, they were either glutting themselves insatiably with food, or else in a state of eagerness for sexual connection. See? So, in many respects, Philo, he sticks with the Jewish interpretation. Because although they mention sex, they never mention it first. They talk about the gluttony, being glutty. See, for all day and all night, they are either glutting themselves insatiably with food, which talks about their richness and their greediness and their not wanting to even give to the stranger. Always eating and drinking and just gluttony. Which goes back to the same thing, and that would be hospitality. And when they weren't eating and drinking, getting drunk, they were always in a state of eagerness for sexual connection. That's not just homosexuality. That's that adultery that we've been reading about for the 11 parts. They were always doing adultery and fornication and rape and bestiality. And men were violating boys, and women were violating girls, and men were violating other young girls and boys and stuff. It's not about homosexuality. It's about their sexual gluttonous. They were just cum freaks. And so we see that Philo writes from a philosophical point of view, talking about how bad God destroys these cities. But what you don't find in Josephus or Philo, You don't find the homosexual interpretation that later Christians would come up with. You don't find it. You don't find it. Here you have two people of Hebrew, of Israelite, of Jewish descent who are in line with the Jewish understanding of the interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah, being greedy and wasteful and profligate and stingy and hating strangers. They fall right in line. A Jew who becomes a Roman, a Hellenized Jew, and they both writing as the contemporaries of Jesus Christ before the bastardization of the teachings of Jesus that would result in a religion known as Christianity, before they bastardized Jesus' original teachings and came up with a fancy smancy word that Jesus himself never used, Christian and Christianity. Jesus never heard such a word, never pronounced such a word. The word Christian was not used when Jesus walked this earth. Sorry, I'm not sorry. But a philosopher and a historian, they got it right when they talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. They never mentioned their same-sex attractions. They never mentioned their homosexuality. They kept it on the Jewish interpretation, and that is one of gluttony, inhospitality, greed, and all kind of sexual deviations, adultery, fornication, rape, pedophilia, pederasty, and bestiality. That's what the abomination were spoken of in Ezekiel, the 16th chapter, verses 49 and 50. I just wanted to give you the first person narratives of some people that were right there in Jesus' time. Not just anybody talking, but bona fide philosophers and historians who are held up to the world as the great ones, as the do-gooders and the top gunners of Jewish literature. We're not done. We are not done. But I thought it was important for you to actually read the first person narrative of Josephus and the first person narrative of Philo. People that were there, lived with Jesus, and people that lived right after Jesus. That's my grandson. All right, that's all. This one's a little bit shorter. I just wanted you to have this information. This is the end of part 12. We are not done. Come back for part 13. I'm Khalil Amani, Professor Khalil Amani, and this is what I do. I'm surgical with my shit, and I teach it. And when I finish with this subject, you will have the complete and comprehensive picture of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. With that, we'll see you again. Peace.